A teaching hospital owes the government $40 billion. 22 contract files are missing. 4 private companies imported goods under the hospital's tax-exempt status. A flood story that collapsed under questioning. And the most important detail in the entire saga is the one nobody's talking about. Because it isn't a detail, it's a pattern. I've spent my career inside hospitals and health programs, small ones, large ones, public and private systems. And I'll tell you what I've seen in every single organization that ended up in a room like this one, in front of a committee like this one, defending itself on a timeline it didn't control. They didn't fail, they drifted. That's what I wanted to talk about today, not the politics, not the people. I want to talk about the 5 drifts that quietly hollow out any healthcare institution. Because if you're watching this, if you sit on a board, if you run a ministry, if you own a clinic, if you manage a hospital, you've already got 1 or 2 of them in your organization right now. The question is whether you are going to see them before they become a headline. I call them the 5 drifts. Each one small in its own. Each one is easy to ignore for a month, for a quarter, for a year. And each one compounds silently until someone external, an auditor, a committee, a journalist names it for you in public. Let me walk you through each one. Every organization has a reporting line on paper. On a slide deck, it looks clean, but in practice, one practice tells you whether the line is real. When was the last time a report actually traveled up the chain? In the UHWI case, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Health told Parliament on record that no report from the hospital comes to him. Not because the hospital is hiding, but because that simply was the arrangement. The hospital managed its own affairs. The ministry funded it. The 2 things never touched. I'm not criticizing anyone in the arrangement. I'm just naming the pattern. Because you can replicate it anywhere. Your board hasn't seen a procurement report in 6 months. That's the drift. Your clinical leadership doesn't receive an operations summary. That's the drift. Your owner hasn't had eyes on the billing aging in a quarter. That's another drift. So here's your check for this week. Pick any reporting line in your organization. Ask who sent the last report. Ask who received it and when. If you cannot get a clean answer in 10 minutes, you've just found the drift. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, right? Because the first drift is about absence, something that did not happen. The second drift is about something that did happen, but nobody can tell you why. At the UHWI, staff were using an internal threshold of $10 million to decide which contracts got uploaded to the government's procurement platform. The actual legal threshold was $1.5 million. When the committee asked who decided on the $10 million, the answer was, and I'm paraphrasing from the hearing, nobody could recall. Let's sit with that for a second. A rule that shaped about 800 procurement decisions, no author, no date, no minute, no memo. And I need you to hear this carefully. This is not unusual. Someone makes a call during a busy week, the call becomes practice, the practice becomes policy, and 3 years later, it's treated as if it came down from Moses himself, except nobody can point to the tablet. And this is the reverse of what I spoke about before. Sometimes the reports do not carry up the chain, but the inverse is that sometimes orders bypass the chain of command, past the CEO, past management to employees, or past the CEO to management, or past the board to the CEO. No emails, no paper trail, just a phone call. Do this right now. All right? So your check for this week, pick one rule that your team follows that isn't obvious. A dollar threshold, a routing rule, a we always or a we never. Ask your team to produce the document that authorized it. If they can, and often they cannot, you found drift number 2. UHWI was using A temporary tax compliance certificate. They've been operating for years on the certificate of their private wing instead of their own. So each individual decision along the timeline was probably defensible. The medicines had to come in. The goods had to clear. The patients couldn't wait. So you use what you have. But here's what shortcuts do in healthcare organizations. They start as a patch. They survive one audit because no one looked. They survive two because that's how we've always handled it. By year 5, they're not a shortcut anymore. They're the system. And the real system, the one that was supposed to be built, never got built because the shortcut was keeping the lights on. Every healthcare organization I've walked into has one of these. A billing workaround, a consent form kept in a shared drive because the EHR field doesn't exist, a credentialing file that lives in one person's email. They're all shortcuts that became structural. Your check for this week. Ask your team what they're doing that was supposed to be temporary. Write down what they say. If the list has more than 3 items, you don't have a process problem. You now have a structural shortcut problem, which is a much bigger thing than wearing a smaller costume. 22 procurement contract files, valued at $267 million, are missing. The first explanation offered to the committee involved flooding in a storage area. Was a reasonable explanation. Roofs leak, water damages files, and then 2 weeks later, under more careful questioning, the hospital's own positioning had changed. There had been damage, yes, but no files had actually been destroyed by the flooding. The flood could not explain the absence. I want to be very clear, but I also want to be absolutely fair here. The people in that room were not lying. What happened is the most human thing in the world. When a gap appears, the organization reaches for the nearest possible explanation. And the explanation that gets offered, it gets offered in good faith before it's tested. The pattern is this: when the explanation for a gap changes under questioning, the gap is the real story, not the explanation, the gap. You will see this in your own organization. It almost never looks like a scandal. It looks like, oh, that was because of the turnover last year, or we had a system migration, or that period was during COVID. These may all be true, but they may all be covering up a gap that nobody has actually explained. Your check for this week. The next time someone in your team explains a gap, write down the explanation. Ask the same question again in a different meeting. If the answer changes, the gap is what you should be looking at. This one is the hardest to talk about without getting political, so let's keep it clinical. In late 2023, a board chair at the UHWI raised concerns, procurement irregularities, suspected payroll fraud, 30% of potential billing revenue written off or uncollected. The board was subsequently dissolved. The minister at the time cited personality conflicts. The chair said the disagreement was about reform, right? I wasn't in the room. What I'm here to say is that the audit that landed in 2026 confirmed a version of the concerns raised in 2023, which means the organization had in its possession a working early warning system. But the problem is that signal was interpreted as noise. Every governance failure has a person somewhere who named it early and was treated as a problem, right? I'm not telling you to side with any particular messenger in your own organization. I'm telling you something more uncomfortable. If you're a board chair, a CEO, or an owner, your instinct when someone brings you an inconvenient truth is almost always to categorize the messenger before the message. We've all done it. Every leader I know has done it. Your check. Think about the last person in the organization who brought you information you didn't want. Where are they now? Here's what I've come to believe after years of watching this pattern play out. The organizations that make the headlines aren't the worst managed ones. They're the ones that run out of time before they run out of drift. Every organization has some drift. Yours does. Mine has when I've run them. The question is never whether drift exists. The question is whether the organization has a rhythm, a cadence, a set of eyes, an operating system that catches the drift while it's still small. UHWI did not lose $40 billion in a single decision. It lost it one subvention shortfall at a time, one uncatalogued rule at a time, one shortcut at a time. For 15 years, in plain view, under the oversight of people who I genuinely believe were trying to do their jobs. So, take the 5 drifts. Score your own organization against each one. Honestly for yourself, in a notebook, reporting lines, unsourced rules, structural shortcuts, changing explanations, dissolved messengers. Give each one an amber or a green. If you have 3 ambers, you're where most healthcare organizations are. If you have 2 reds, you don't have a scandal problem yet. You have a timeline problem. The audit is coming. You just don't know when.